one of the things I always think about as a composer is that everything we're surrounded by in terms of music and sound somehow feeds into kind of this, tapestry of ideas that you play with. So for me, when I was, I remember from when we still lived in India, my mom used to work for Indian classical radio. So in the mornings, instead of having an alarm clock go off, you'd wake up because your parents are just cranking Indian classical music through. This is, like all the tape decks. And then, so being surrounded by Indian classical music was a big part of what I remember from my actual, like the youngest part of my childhood. And then when I was 7, my family moved to Hong Kong. And that was, just culturally a very interesting experience because I felt so out of place. There is kind of a little Indian community in Hong Kong, but not a huge one. And the cultures are so foreign in some ways. And Hong Kong is such an interesting place also because of the kind of the colonial background. So for me, it was like, I used to go to an international school that was a British school, but you're surrounded by Chinese culture in day-to-day life and, Cantonese and Mandarin as far as the languages that you're hearing. Music was so interesting because at home we listened to Indian classical music. Public transit, you'd listen to whatever's playing, there's a lot of cantopop and like sometimes really traditional Chinese folk music and things like that as well. And then at school, we'd be in choir and you're doing kind of Western classical music and I was taking piano lessons and kind of really being surrounded by so many very different styles of music. And, obviously coming from the different cultures, but also one of the things that was interesting about it is really this kind of sense of like serious music versus not serious music. I don't know if I love those words, but kind of, thinking about how you're surrounded by the popular music. And this is popular Chinese music, popular Indian music, popular Western music, and also kind of the more, there needs to be a better word that really describes everything that goes into it. But art music, for lack of another one, where you're looking at kind of the stage music and the concert music and the performance music from, again, each of these different cultures. So, my musical background growing up, I think, was just to do with being exposed to a lot of different things and like learning and pulling sounds and ideas from a lot of different things. And one of my favorite things about it was learning how to appreciate all these different styles of music. That's something I still kind of try to carry in all my work today. And even when I'm working with students, this idea that you can appreciate a lot of very different things and learn something from everything that you listen to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it kind of ties back to what we were just talking about, this idea of like drawing influences from all sorts of different types of music. So the specific ones that you mentioned, so Indian classical music, for example, for me, one of the things that is just spectacular about that as a style is melody and ornamentation. There's just like this incredible fluidity to how notes are sung and how notes are played. And, that we just is not at all a part of the idiom of what we do in Western classical music. So that's something that it started subconsciously when I first started working as a composer, and now it's more and more conscious, I think. That kind of melodic ornamentation is something I try to draw upon. You mentioned, I'm trying to think what else you said, spectralists, I think you mentioned. Yeah. That's so another, completely different style. But to me, they're one of the things that has always fascinated me is this idea of like constructing sound, not just taking sound out of an instrument or sound out of a voice as kind of a, as a given, but being able to manipulate sound and layer sounds and shape sounds to create something that's more multidimensional. Kind of, thinking about, I suppose, sounds in a way that's analogous to what you would do electronically. You can take a sound and reinforce these frequencies and kind of weaken these frequencies and kind of create something that's more multidimensional than just the sound would have been unprocessed or unaffected. And kind of, leaning into that even when I'm writing acoustic music as a way to really get your hands dirty and manipulate the sound more than you can do otherwise. I will give the disclaimer. I don't know if this is the definitive sort of illustration of what it is, but what I understand spectralists to be are composers and musicians who play quite literally with the spectra of sound. So analyzing sounds, looking at the frequencies that make up different sounds, and then often using electronic media or electronic means to manipulate them in some way. I think that's to do with pacing mostly, and kind of this idea of even just like ambience and sound. You think about traditionally when we think about Western classical music, and one of the things that's exciting about writing music now and performing music now is that everybody has their own version of what that means and how you build music and what music should even be. Still, there's kind of, in the back burner, sort of this idea that it needs to be music that has some harmonic movement and some certain kinds of changes and progression. And one of the things I've always loved about listening to progressive metal, for example, is that the basic paradigm is different. It can often be about ambient sounds. It's not that there's not harmonic change, but often the pieces are not about harmonic change. It can be about timbre. It can be about layering. The pacing is very different. So kind of all these different ways to kind of approach how things happen and what things happen in a piece that are very different from the paradigm I think we kind of start out with in terms of Western classical music. Sure. I remember reading something years ago. Esa-Pekka Salonen had talked about how he started conducting, and I just, I loved this because this was true for me, and I think true for many composers as well. He mentioned that he wanted to make more opportunities to have his music played, and the obvious way to start doing it was to learn how to conduct and, do it himself. And of course, for him, it's been this incredible trajectory. For me, it's much more low-key than I think Mr. Salonen's has been, but in my case it was that same idea of wanting to, one, make opportunities to get my music out there. Two, I love new music, I love sharing new music, and I love performing other people's music. So also just getting to really, as the composer, you can just kind of listen to other people's music and analyze it. But as a conductor, you really can be invested in it and kind of learn it inside out, which was something I always loved doing. And there's something very exciting about premiering other people's work as well, and putting new pieces out there for the first time. That's something I've always loved. And there is so much cross-pollination back and forth. I think, you learn every time you perform, learn something musically, learn something about composition every time you perform a new piece that really resonates with you. So I know in performing new pieces and conducting new pieces, I learned something from that'll make its way into my composition. And I think, there's so much overlap between how composers think and how conductors have to think, in that you're so invested in the sound start to finish, and you have to understand whatever piece you're doing, like in such a hands-on way to make sense of it. I think the two really do feed back and forth. Oh gosh, no, not at all. I I remember when I was applying for college, we were still in Hong Kong at that point, and I had been taking lots of piano lessons, and I used to take voice lessons and violin, lots of musical things. But I was also, I was really interested in physics and science. And at the time I thought I was probably going to try to do a double major in computer science and something else. And, I just remember looking up schools that had music programs that sounded interesting, and just kind of off the cuff deciding, well, I think I can put together a composition portfolio. That doesn't sound all that hard. You talk about not knowing kind of what you're putting yourself in for. It was just this very weird experience of just trying to see if I could get in for a double major for both, and putting together a portfolio. And to this day, I have no idea how I got into USC's program for composition, because I look at the bar that students have to make these days to get in, and that wouldn't, I truly have no idea how I got in. that, you know, I remember it was my first time being in the United States as well, like coming from my freshman orientation and realizing that my class of composition students was 4 other students or 3 other students. You know, and everybody else had been studying composition for many years, and I was like, I didn't know that composition was a thing you could study. It just sounded like fun. But, you know, learned very quickly, and, you know, obviously I really loved music and was excited to do it. And within the first couple of years, I realized I was more interested in the work I was doing in music than in the work I was doing in computer science. So kind of gradually let that go, and that's been my path since. But it was not a very well planned trajectory at the start. It's kind of just finding yourself there and letting things flow as they would. That's a great question. And, you know, I think the answer depends a little bit on who it is that you're trying to bring in. So my experience has been there's kind of 2 groups of people who I think have potential to be really interested in actually contemporary music, just maybe they don't know it yet. One is, I think there's this group of people who really love classical music. And when I say classical, I mean really traditional Mozart, Beethoven, classical music, who either have not been exposed to contemporary music yet, or they've been exposed to it, but only like 1 or 2 styles of it. That, you know, there's the sense of what contemporary music is, which is not actually at all representative of what it is exactly. And, you know, it's a group that I think can often be really excited about new music, but you kind of have to figure out where they're starting from. You know, whether it's that they just haven't been exposed to new music at all, or maybe they've been exposed to some and they haven't liked the particular style or styles that they've been exposed to. And I've done a couple of projects in the past where we found things like thematic programming, for example, or like, you know, hidden programming or secret programming, or just something where you kind of invite people in the door without yet limiting or without trying to set up any preconceived notions of what they're going to hear. Just an idea, a theme, something to get people in the door with an open mind. I think that is often actually a really great way to bring people into new music. And the other group, I would say, and this is actually probably by far the much larger group, is kind of people who are not necessarily interested in classical music, whatever that means, classical music, but people who listen to popular music, to folk music, to all the like normal musics of today. One of the things I think is actually really interesting these days is that we as composers draw on so many of the same kind of tools, techniques, sounds. I think there's more crossover right now between like stage music and, you know, non-stage, non-concert music than probably there ever has been in the past. So I think there's a lot of room to get people interested in contemporary music who maybe don't care about the traditional classical music at all. And it's, again, that same idea of kind of finding the points of overlap. So there's a number of projects where they'll do like film, either, you know, silent film type things or like film scores live that just kind of, it's one way to introduce people who maybe don't have an interest in classical music into what is being written these days for by and for contemporary musicians. But anything really where you can start making connections to, again, themes are a good idea, events that are about more than just the music on the stage. Just like a broader event, a broader story, a broader festival are great ways to get people in the door. Because I've been surprised how often people get interested in new music once they hear it. It's just getting that first hurdle that you just got to get them to hear it the first time and find something that they like. I think it's actually a really exciting time to try to bring new audiences in. Maybe a couple of different points of intersection, I suppose. One is, so nature and wilderness, of course, I'll treat those separately from the self-defense part of it. You know, there's a fine tradition of composers finding inspiration in wild places. That's certainly, you know, it's not a new thing, but it's something I feel like for each person who goes and discovers it, there's still something really personal about that kind of inspiration. So for me, there are a few different themes that tend to keep coming up in the music that I write. Women's stories is one, nature and the environment is another one. And, you know, I don't write programmatic music. It's not like I'll spend, you know, weeks in the backcountry and then try to write music that is that experience or that tells the story. But I find a lot of inspiration in kind of colors and textures and natural sounds and trying to bring that into the music I write. Absolutely. In a broader sense too, I suppose the second part of your question, we're asking about things like my background as a self-defense and wilderness survival instructor. One of the things I find really fascinating, and I'm working on a project with my husband, Nick Gerpe, who's a pianist right now on this as well, is this kind of idea of who we are as performers and musicians. You know, there's like this very strong culture of like performance coaching and building performance skills for sports and athletics in a way that there isn't really in music. And that's something that, you know, Nick and I have found really interesting. Because you see students struggling with a lot of the same things. You see some younger musicians struggling with a lot of the same things. And it's interesting that we have this huge culture and training and resources to help athletes in some of those, you know, dealing with some of the same issues, but we don't have that really for musicians. So this is maybe a different way of answering your question about how some of these, you know, different elements come together. But another part of that that really interests me is kind of finding these points of overlap between musicians as athletes, musicians as performers, and kind of trying to draw from my background towards that as well, particularly in terms of what I do in teaching. Oh, I wish there were a standard process. I can try to tell you about my process. I mean, it always changes depending on what the project is. You know, I feel like right now in my life, projects kind of come from two directions. Mostly there's a prompt from somebody commissioning a piece, which automatically gives me some parameters and a framework as a place to start, you know. So for example, I have a project coming up in a couple of months, which is a piece for the Oregon Mozart players. And it's, you know, an orchestra piece that I'm writing, and they had some feedback and some parameters that they gave me to work within. So my process there starts with just looking very carefully at exactly what the box is within which I'm working. And then trying to think about, okay, where do I find inspiration for that? In the case of this piece, it's taking inspiration from an experience I had diving and hearing humpback whales underwater. So it was incredible. I highly recommend anybody who gets the chance do that. But so kind of, you know, brainstorming sounds and ideas and textures that come out of that experience and come out of those sounds. And I'm a pretty visual person, so it's a lot of sketching out words first and shapes and just very broad ideas. And then I improvise also. You know, when I work with students, it's a big thing that we talk about. I hate that in classical music, often there's this sense that there's, again, another one of these artificial hard lines between improvisation and composition, where really they're the same thing and they feed back and forth so much. So a lot of, for me, the process is like sketching, then improvising, then refining, then sketching some more, and kind of going in circles around the process until there's a finished work at the end of it. I'd say 50-50. I love aleatory. It just depends on the project. So there's probably half my scores, actually, a lot of them have some aleatory in them, other than like certain specific projects where just given the parameters, it doesn't make sense. I'll avoid it often. Okay, that's a big question. In a very, very broad sense, the like issues to do with women and girls and getting an education are things that have just always been really important to me. For the obvious reasons, I think we should all be caring about it, frankly. but also, thinking about like women in my family, and even like my mom wanting to study music when she was younger and she wasn't allowed to. And I've had cousins who are still in India and family members who wanted to pursue educations and weren't allowed to. So there is a personal element to it, as well as just the obvious, of course, all girls should be given an education and given those opportunities. So one of the volunteer projects I did, this was a few years ago, there's a group, they've recently changed their name, which is why I'm hesitating. They used to be called the Bangladesh Girls Surf Club. Then it became the Bangladesh Girls and Boys Surf Club. And I think just in the last couple of months, they've actually been adopted under a larger umbrella group as well. But this was a group I got to know about through some volunteering I was doing here locally in Southern California. And, it's this fascinating story about this group of girls in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which is one of the poorest parts of Bangladesh, which is already obviously such a poverty-stricken country. And this group of young girls, basically, they saw a lifeguard surfing on the beach one day, and they asked him to teach them how to surf. And what I loved about their story, and what I loved about kind of volunteering with the group afterwards, was that they built what started as just teaching the girls to surf, turned into a school for the girls, so that they were, given an education. And many of them had until that point never gone to school. Often the girls in that community are married away at like 11 or 12 years old to much older men. The club, because of donations, because of fundraising, because they were able to give food bags and aid to the families, kind of then enabled also the girls who were not married away that early. They actually had kind of bought them literally the years to be able to go to school and be able to learn and be able to graduate. So kind of, as a group I was volunteering with on and off for a couple of years, mostly through our work here in Southern California. But, their stories really stuck with me. And I got to know the founders of the club. So I had a couple of, Skype calls on tiny screens with the girls and getting to hear their stories through the language barrier. And, I think that's led to a couple of things. One is just in a very broad sense, wanting to push in every way possible for girls to have a voice. That's girls as composers. That's girls to have an education. Like in any way that we can talk about that and make that possible, I think I want to be doing that. More kind of, I suppose, more specifically to your answer about how that's inspired my work as well, outside of speaking about it, and outside of kind of trying to fundraise for it. We also did a musical project, I want to say last year, for the Prototype Festival. That was also a digital short about that same story, about the girls and about their experience, and about, fighting to be able to make choices and get an education. Okay, that's a huge question, because I feel like it's kind of like the earlier, there's so many women. I mean, there's just so many inspiring women. I hesitate to start listing names because I know I'll leave out names that are really and truly important to me. I mean, I will say this actually, so without specifically naming names, one of the things I find really fascinating about listening to women's stories is that there are stories of strength and courage and fighting for opportunities and making opportunities at like every level, from like, big names that everybody will recognize, to your neighbor, to your aunt, to your mom's best friend's cousin. That's one of the things that always has fascinated me. Like, I remember my mom telling not only her own stories of when she was a child and kind of what it meant to be a girl, as far as the opportunities that she was given and the things she had to fight to do. And then thinking about like one of her best friends, and this is a woman I've never met, but I remember hearing about her from my mother, about in the 70s in India, this young woman had a child out of wedlock, and what that meant in India in the 70s at that time. And one of the things that I find really, really poignant about that is that it's kind of every woman's experience. Like, I can talk about finding, Malala and Jane Goodall and all these people who I think are just like fascinating role models and huge names that have contributed so much, that I find truly inspiring. But I actually think there is something about these kind of smaller human stories about what it means to be a woman that almost speaks to be more, because that is everybody's experience. It's not the same experience, but everybody has their own version of that experience that I think is there's a lot of weight to. So for me, I don't know, I think when I think about women's stories, it really is both of that. I have a long list of women who I admire, who are, big names that I think everybody would recognize, but I actually think I find more weight in the stories of average women, or perhaps average is a wrong word, average, or those that, their stories are not told in the same way. They're not celebrities, they're not big names, and kind of things that they have had to overcome just to be, to survive, to work, to live their lives. I've always found those particularly interesting. In terms of my music, of course, I have a number of projects that do take stories of very specific women and try to tell those. But even in a kind of more general sense, I think where I can find a way to use women's words, for example, rather than men's words, not that there's anything wrong with men's words, where I have the opportunity to do that, I like to do that just as an homage to not even necessarily a specific woman, but to every woman. It's such a varied group. I mean, I look at, for example, as a mentor, somebody like Beth Morrison and all the work that she's been doing in the last couple of years, to support new music, to support women in music, to bring new audiences into music. Like thinking about people who were mentors, people like that. Stacey Brightman, who until very recently was at Alieatory, is another woman that I've, loved learning from and speaking to about music, and learning from her work, and kind of even thinking about her history of championing for other composers for a very long time. I've had teachers, Erica Mull from USC. That was quite a while ago. It's making me feel my age as I say that, but incredible composer, fabulous teacher, somebody I learned so much from, not just about music, but also about just navigating the musical world. And our field. So just, I know I'm leaving out so many women, and so many people, mentors who I've worked with, musicians who I work with and learn so much from. I feel like you learn something from each new person that you collaborate with and work with. Two pieces of advice. One, because I always get this question about how do you get started as a composer? And I think the answer is not to overthink it and just do it. Just write music. And write, I say loosely, write doesn't necessarily have to mean write with pen, doesn't have to mean write on the computer. Write just means create music, play music, record music in whatever way you can. Because I think everything else, all the refinement, all the technique comes from there. And it has to start with first making sound, right? The other thing, and I think this is probably more pertinent as composers get a little further in their career, is just how important it is to be flexible. That word came up earlier, and to be entrepreneurial. I think, our field has just, it feels like it's rapid fire how quick it's been changing, even in the last 10, 15 years. I think about technology and people's attention spans, and now the pandemic, and how that's going to change everything. I really think for us to survive as artists, we have to be almost more entrepreneurial and more able to pivot and find opportunities than non-artists do. That sounds counterintuitive in some ways, I know, but I really think that it's important. So I study business where you can, find opportunities where you can, make opportunities where you can possibly put something together. I think those are just core ideas that are so important for any musicians right now. I mean, it's been a whirlwind. Now we're entering 2022 as you and I are having this conversation, and it's my feelings about the pandemic were one thing last year if you had asked me this, and in 2022 it feels like it's been a series of these ups and downs and ups and downs. And you and I were talking about some silver linings as far as opportunities that had come up, and digitally being able to share music and reach audiences that otherwise we don't get to. And on the one sense, I'm so grateful for some of those silver linings. Like, I've met a number of people, like fabulous people, musicians, new audience members, like just new connections that I don't think would have happened without the pandemic, things that I'm really grateful for. But yes, there's been a lot of uncertainty also with projects being canceled and postponed, and things that are kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern currently, because you're not 100% sure what will happen. And I everybody's in the same boat as far as not knowing exactly what's going to happen day to day, much less week to week and month to month. I think we're all just trying to keep positive, trying to keep flexible, and just ready to roll with whatever happens next. Sure. One I'm really excited about right now is actually a commission for Songfest, which I guess is moving up to San Francisco this year. It's a big change that I'm quite excited about. And I'm still working out some of the details, but I know that it's going to be a song cycle somehow inspired by Afghani women's voices. And I found a couple of texts that I am really excited to set. I guess I'll give the short version, in that there were a couple of poetry societies in Afghanistan where there were, one of the things they had was an anonymous phone line that you could call in and share poetry, because some of these young women were, again, not allowed to be involved in anything artistic, not allowed to share anything artistic. So I found a few transcripts of just poetry somebody had called in anonymously to this phone line and left on a voicemail, and that was how they would share their feelings and their art, because it's the only way that they were able to. So that is what I'm taking as a starting point for this project for Songfest. I'm really excited to write. There's also the orchestra piece for organ Mozart players that is coming up in April, really excited about. A number of other small projects right now. I think I'm so excited that there are projects given all the challenges of this past time, and just really grateful to be able to write music for ensembles that I'm really inspired by and musicians that I'm really inspired by. And yeah, just really grateful for the opportunities as they come, basically.